The morning mist clung to Fort Blackwater like a shroud, thick enough to taste and heavy with the promise of another sweltering Georgia day. By 7 in the morning, the humidity had already wrapped itself around everything like a wet blanket, making the air shimmer with moisture that turned every breath into a conscious effort. Most sensible people would have waited for the air conditioning to kick in before venturing outside, but Captain Elena Vasquez had never been accused of being sensible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She walked through the main gate with the kind of measured pace that spoke of someone who understood that rushing rarely solved anything worth solving. Her civilian clothes hung loose and comfortable against her frame, faded jeans that had seen real wear and a simple gray t-shirt that revealed nothing about her past or her purpose. No insignia marked her status, no visible scars announced her experience. Just worn leather boots that had walked through places most people only saw in nightmares, and a small canvas messenger bag that contained everything she needed for the day ahead. Everything about her seemed deliberately unremarkable, carefully constructed to blend into any crowd without drawing unwanted attention. But there was something in the way she moved that set her apart from the usual stream of visitors and contractors who passed through the gates each morning. Her steps were too controlled, too economical, like someone who had learned that every movement could mean the difference between completing a mission and becoming a casualty report that disappeared into classified files. The gate guard, a young corporal who looked like he had been counting down the minutes until his shift change since the moment he had arrived, barely glanced up from his clipboard as she approached. His uniform was crisp enough to suggest he took pride in his appearance, but his posture carried the kind of casual boredom that came from processing hundreds of routine entries without anything interesting ever happening. He waved her through with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed the same action thousands of times before, his attention already returning to whatever video was playing on his phone before she had even passed the checkpoint. Elena nodded once in acknowledgement and continued walking, her messenger bag settling into a comfortable position against her hip as she navigated the maze of concrete buildings and carefully manicured lawns that made Fort Blackwater look more like a university campus than a military installation. She had been awake since 4 that morning, sitting on the edge of a motel bed that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and decades of transient occupancy. The kind of place that catered to people who needed somewhere to stay without questions being asked about why they might require such anonymity. Her gear bag had sat open on the room's single chair, its contents organized with the kind of precision that became automatic after enough years of knowing that your life might depend on being able to find exactly what you needed in complete darkness. Clean clothes folded with military corners, toiletries arranged in order of priority, and at the very bottom, wrapped carefully in a piece of black silk that had once been part of something beautiful, a small metal object that she had not looked at in over 6 months. She had pulled it out that morning, held it up to the weak light filtering through curtains that had seen better decades, and forced herself to remember. The weight of it in her palm was heavier than physics could account for, dense with memories that refused to stay buried no matter how deeply she tried to push them down. 3 small notches carved into the surface, each one representing a moment when everything had changed, when the luxury of hesitation had been stripped away and replaced with the stark clarity of survival. The first notch had been earned in a dusty village whose name she still could not pronounce correctly, where intel had been wrong and backup had been delayed, and the choice had been between pulling the trigger and watching her team leader die in front of her. The second had come during a night insertion that had gone sideways so fast that years later she still woke up sometimes expecting to hear the sound of automatic weapons fire echoing through her dreams. The third notch was the one that haunted her most, earned during an operation that officially had never happened in a country that the government claimed they had never visited. where a split-second decision had saved the lives of 12 hostages and cost the life of someone who had probably been somebody's son. She had promised herself after that third notch that she would take one final assignment before hanging up her rifle forever. Not for glory or recognition or any of the things that civilians thought motivated soldiers, but simply to prove to herself that she could still do the job without losing the part of her soul that remembered what it felt like to be human. Opportunity had come in the form of a training position at Fort Blackwater, working with the new counter-sniper program that was supposed to revolutionize how the military dealt with long-range threats in urban environments. Inside the Special Operations Training Command building, the air conditioning was fighting its usual losing battle against the Georgia humidity, and the result was an uncomfortable compromise that left everyone slightly damp and irritable. 3 instructors lounged around a makeshift break area that consisted of folding tables, metal chairs, and a coffee machine that looked like it had been salvaging from a 1970s office building. They were deep in conversation about something on a tablet screen, their voices carrying the kind of casual authority that came from being the experts in a room full of people who were still learning the basics. The conversation stopped when Elena walked through the door, and she could feel their eyes cataloging details about her appearance, making the kind of quick assessments that military personnel learn to do automatically whenever someone new entered their space. She could see them taking in her civilian clothes, her lack of visible rank or military bearing, the way she stood waiting patiently for them to acknowledge her presence instead of demanding immediate attention. "Help you with something?" The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Marcus Chin, a man whose uniform suggested he took his role as a training instructor seriously, but whose tone indicated he had already decided she did not belong in his domain. He was the kind of professional who had worked hard to earn his position and was protective of the standards that came with it, which meant he had little patience for what he perceived as civilian interference in military matters. Elena approached their impromptu workstation and placed a folder on the table between them, her movements deliberate but not aggressive. "Captain Elena Vasquez, I have authorization for observer status in your advanced marksmanship program. Starting today." She opened the folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper, unfolding it once and laying it flat where all 3 instructors could see it clearly. The letterhead was official, the signatures were genuine, and the authorization was unambiguous. But she could see in their faces that none of that mattered as much as what they were seeing when they looked at her. Observer status? This came from Sergeant First Class David Park, whose voice carried the particular note of skepticism that suggested he had encountered his share of civilian contractors who thought they understood military operations because they had watched enough movies. "What exactly are you observing for?" "Program effectiveness evaluation," Elena replied, her voice level and professional. "Assessment of current methodologies and potential recommendations for improvement." The 3rd instructor, Master Sergeant Riley Thompson, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, his posture suggesting that he had heard enough to form an opinion about the situation. "Let me guess. Pentagon sent another consultant to tell us how to do our jobs better." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What's your background? Corporate training? Academic research? Maybe some time at a civilian shooting range? Elena could have told them about the 3 tours and places that did not appear on any official deployment records, about the advanced sniper training that had taken her to schools that existed only in rumors and classified budgets, about the operations that had required her to take shots that most people could not even imagine. Instead, she simply said, "I have some experience with precision shooting." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Elena recognized the look that passed between them. It was the same expression she had seen countless times before, in briefing rooms and mess halls, and anywhere else that people made assumptions about what she was capable of based on what they could see on the surface. She was too small, too quiet, too polite to be taken seriously as someone who might actually understand the complexities of military marksmanship training. Some experience, Sergeant Chin repeated, his tone suggesting that he found her choice of words amusing. "Ma'am, with all due respect, what we do here isn't hobby shooting or weekend competitions. This is training soldiers for combat situations where missing your target means people die." "I understand," Elena said simply, making no effort to elaborate or defend her qualifications. "Do you?" Master Sergeant Thompson's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too. "Many civilians think they understood military life because they had read about it or watched documentaries. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like someone in Washington decided to send U.S. a babysitter who thinks she knows better than the people who actually train snipers for a living." Elena did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not attempt to prove her worth through verbal sparring. She simply picked up her folder, closed it carefully, and stepped back toward a row of chairs positioned along the wall where she could observe the training area through a large window that offered a clear view of the rifle range stretching out into the distance. "You can observe all you want," Sergeant Park called after her, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who felt he had successfully defended his territory. "But don't expect us to change how we do things just because some paper pusher thinks we need improvement." Elena sat down, placed her bag at her feet, and folded her hands in her lap. From her position, she could see the training range where advanced marksmanship students were setting up for their morning exercises, their movements precise and professional as they prepared equipment that could reach out and touch targets at distances that defied common understanding of what rifles could accomplish. The three instructors returned to their conversation, their voices lower now but still loud enough for her to hear the occasional comment about civilians who thought they understood military operations and bureaucrats who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Elena closed her eyes and let the familiar sounds wash over her, the distant crack of rifle fire, the mechanical precision of bolt-action cycling, the metallic ping of brass casings hitting concrete. Sounds that had been the soundtrack to some of the most important moments of her adult life, both the ones she was proud of and the ones that still visited her in dreams. The minutes passed slowly in the humid air, and Elena remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled and economical. Her patience, the kind that came from learning to wait in places where moving at the wrong time could compromise an entire mission. Every so often, one of the instructors would glance her way and shake his head, as if she were a problem that would eventually solve itself if they just ignored her long enough. A young soldier walked past, rifle case slung over his shoulder, and he looked at Elena with curious eyes, taking in the way she sat perfectly still in the uncomfortable heat, without fidgeting or checking her phone every few minutes. There was something about her stillness that reminded him of his grandfather, an old army sniper who had the same quality of absolute patience, as if he could wait forever if necessary and never seemed to doubt that his patience would eventually be rewarded. "Ma'am," the soldier said, slowing down as he passed. "You okay out here? It's getting pretty warm." Elena opened her eyes and looked at him, noting the respectful way he addressed her despite her civilian clothes, the genuine concern in his voice. "Just waiting," she replied simply. The young man nodded and continued on his way, but he looked back twice before disappearing into the range building. Something about the way she sat there, perfectly composed despite the rising heat, reminded him that there were different kinds of strength in the world, and not all of them announced themselves with loud voices or aggressive postures. Inside the building, the air conditioning hummed its mechanical song, and Elena Vasquez continued to wait. She had made a promise to herself and to the memory of people who could no longer keep their own promises, and she intended to see it through, regardless of how long it took or how many people thought she did not belong there. The rifle range stretched out before her, waiting as well, and somewhere in the distance, The sound of precision shooting continued its ancient rhythm. The morning training session was in full swing when General Patricia Morrison made her unscheduled appearance at the Special Operations Training Command Building. She moved with the confident stride of someone who had spent 32 years earning the right to walk into any military facility and expect immediate respect, her uniform bearing the kind of understated authority that came from leading soldiers. In places where leadership meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, General Morrison was 54 years old and had commanded everything from platoons to entire divisions, serving in conflicts that ranged from conventional warfare to the shadow operations that never appeared in official histories. Her face carried the weathered look of someone who had made life-and-death decisions in real time, and her eyes held the particular depth that came from understanding the true cost of military service. She had come to Fort Blackwater for a routine inspection of the new counter-sniper program, but what she discovered when she arrived was anything but routine. The sound of voices from the instructor area caught her attention as she entered the building, and she paused to listen. What she heard was a conversation that made her jaw tighten with the kind of anger that came from witnessing professional standards being compromised by personal prejudice. "I'm telling you, she's been sitting there for 3 hours, Sergeant," Chun was saying, his voice carrying the tone of someone sharing an amusing anecdote. "Just staring at the range like she's trying to absorb marksmanship skills through osmosis. Probably thinks if she watches enough, she'll be able to write a report about how we're doing everything wrong," Sergeant Park added, his words drawing chuckles from his colleagues. "You know how these consultant types are. They watch a few exercises and suddenly they're experts on military training." "What's her background again?" Master Sergeant Thompson asked, though his tone suggested he was not genuinely interested in the answer. "Says she has some experience with precision shooting," Chun replied, making air quotes with his fingers. "Probably means she went to a shooting range once and hit the paper. Now she thinks she can evaluate a program that trains soldiers for combat operations." The laughter that followed carried an edge of mockery that General Morrison found deeply unprofessional. She had spent enough years in the military to recognize the sound of people who were more interested in protecting their egos than maintaining the standards of excellence that military service demanded. "Did you see her paperwork?" Thompson continued. "Authorization from some Pentagon office nobody's ever heard of. Probably friends with someone important and thought it would be fun to play soldier for a day." General Morrison had heard enough. She turned toward the window where she could see the observer they were discussing, and what she saw made her stop in her tracks. The woman sat with perfect military bearing, back straight but not rigid, hands folded in a way that suggested both patience and readiness. Her stillness was not the fidgety waiting of someone out of their element, but the controlled composure of someone who had learned to wait in places where patience was a survival skill. More importantly, as General Morrison moved closer to get a better look, she noticed something that the instructors had apparently missed entirely. The woman's left sleeve was pushed up slightly, revealing a portion of her forearm. And there, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a small mark that made the general's blood run cold. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who had not seen its like before, but unmistakable to someone with General Morrison's background. 3 small parallel lines, each no more than half an inch long, carved into the skin with the kind of precision that spoke of military discipline and deadly purpose. They were positioned just below the wrist, where they would be hidden by long sleeves or gloves, but visible to anyone who knew their significance. Kill marks. Specifically, the kind of kill marks that were earned by military snipers who had taken lives in the service of their country, carved into their own skin as a permanent reminder of the weight they carried. General Morrison had seen similar marks exactly 4 times in her career, and each time they had belonged to someone whose service record was so classified that even she did not have full access to their operational history. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The woman sitting quietly in the observation area was not some civilian consultant or Pentagon bureaucrat playing at being military. She was a veteran sniper, possibly one of the most elite marksmen in the entire military, and these instructors were treating her like an inconvenience that needed to be tolerated until she went away. General Morrison walked directly to where Elena was sitting, her approach measured but purposeful. As she got closer, she could see more details that confirmed her growing suspicions. The woman's posture was not just disciplined, but specifically trained, the kind of physical control that came from hours of practicing to remain perfectly still while waiting for the perfect shot. Her breathing was slow and controlled, economical in a way that suggested someone who had learned to manage their body's responses under extreme stress. "Ma'am," General Morrison said quietly, her voice carrying the respect due to someone whose service had earned recognition rather than suspicion. Elena looked up, and the general found herself looking into brown eyes that held depths she could not read. There was something in her gaze that reminded Morrison of deep water, calm on the surface but with currents running underneath that could be both beautiful and dangerous. These were the eyes of someone who had seen things that most people could not imagine, who had made decisions that would haunt lesser individuals for the rest of their lives. "General," Elena replied, her voice neutral but respectful. She had clearly identified Morrison's rank from 50 feet away, probably from the way she carried herself more than any visible insignia. "I couldn't help but notice your ink, General." Morrison kept her voice low, conversational, the kind of tone used for discussions that were not meant to be overheard. "That's some very specific artwork." Elena did not flinch, did not try to cover the marks, did not deflect with humor or false modesty. Most people would have made some joke about youthful mistakes or claimed they were decorative tattoos with personal meaning. Elena simply looked at the general with those steady brown eyes and remained silent, neither confirming nor denying what Morrison had observed. "It is," she finally replied, offering no explanation or elaboration. "Mind if I ask where you earned them?" The general's question carried the weight of someone who understood that not all military service was created equal, that some experiences went far beyond what appeared in official records or public acknowledgments. Elena studied Morrison's face for a long moment, reading details in her posture and bearing that the training instructors had completely missed. She was cataloging the subtle signs that separated people who had been tested by real combat from those who had only experienced training scenarios, noting the particular kind of weathering around the general's eyes that came from making decisions under fire. "Kandahar Province," Elena said quietly, speaking the name of a place where American forces had conducted operations that existed only in the most classified archives. "Helmand, Kuner." Each name was delivered with the kind of matter-of-fact tone that came from someone who had no need to dramatize experiences that spoke for themselves. These were places where task force operations had been conducted under conditions so dangerous and politically sensitive that their existence was denied by multiple government agencies, where snipers had operated in support of missions that could never be officially acknowledged. General Morrison felt something shift in her chest, a combination of respect, recognition, and growing anger at the treatment this woman had received from her instructors. "What's your call sign?" she asked, though part of her already suspected. She knew the answer. "Whisper," Elena replied simply. The name hit General Morrison like lightning. Whisper, the sniper who had provided overwatch for the extraction at Firebase Mongoose, whose shots had eliminated 3 enemy combatants at ranges that defied belief while friendly forces evacuated under heavy fire. The marksman who had single-handedly neutralized a sniper team that had been terrorizing supply convoys along Highway 1, taking shots that required mathematical precision and nerves of steel. The ghost who had disappeared from all official records after completing a mission that was too successful to acknowledge and too classified to celebrate. Standing before her, Being dismissed and mocked by instructors who did not have 1/10 of her experience was a legend whose service had literally saved hundreds of American lives and whose reputation existed only in whispered conversations among people with the highest security clearances. "Jesus," General Morrison said quietly, then caught herself. "I apologize, ma'am. Your reputation precedes you." "Most people don't recognize the marks," Elena replied, her voice carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from years of being invisible in plain sight. "Most people don't need to." General Morrison looked back toward the instructor area where Elena's credentials had been dismissed and her presence had been treated as an annoyance. Her jaw tightened as she thought about the complete failure to recognize that they were in the presence of someone whose marksmanship skills had been proven under the most demanding conditions imaginable. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in uniform, "you'll be observing from the instructor area today, with full access to all training materials and the respect that your service has earned." Something shifted in Elena's posture at those words. Not relief exactly, but a subtle change from patience to readiness. She had been prepared to sit in the heat all day if necessary, but she had also been prepared for this moment when someone finally saw her for who she was rather than who they assumed her to be. "Thank you, General," she said simply. Morrison turned and walked back toward the instructor area, her stride sharp and purposeful. Behind her, Elena remained seated for a moment longer, but something in her bearing had changed. The waiting was over, and it was time to see whether the current training methods were preparing soldiers for the realities they would face when precision shooting became a matter of life and death. The instructor area fell completely silent the moment General Morrison walked through the door. Her expression was dark enough to change the atmospheric pressure in the room, and everyone present suddenly found their phones, notebooks, or coffee cups extremely interesting. The casual conversation that had been flowing freely just moments before evaporated like morning dew under a blowtorch. "Which one of you dismissed the observer outside?" Her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made people's spines straighten involuntarily, the tone that experienced soldiers recognized as the calm before a storm that would reshape the landscape. Staff Sergeant Chun raised his hand like a student confessing to cheating, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "That was me, General, but she's not on the training roster, and we're running qualification exercises today." "Did you examine her paperwork?" Morrison's question was delivered with the precision of a surgical instrument. "Yes, ma'am." "But did you examine her?" The General's interruption cut through Chun's explanation like a blade through silk. The instructor's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, his brain struggling to process the implications of the question. Around him, his colleagues suddenly found themselves studying their feet with intense concentration, as if the answers to all of life's mysteries might be found in the pattern of their bootlaces. "The woman sitting outside," General Morrison continued, her voice deadly quiet, "has more confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 800 meters than everyone in this room combined. She has conducted precision shooting operations in environments that would break most of your students before they ever touched a rifle. But more importantly," she paused, letting her words sink in like poison into groundwater, "she has earned something that cannot be taught in any classroom or training manual, the right to be here." The silence that followed was so complete that the building's air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. Even the distant sound of rifle fire from the range seemed muted, as if the entire facility was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Master Sergeant Thompson." Morrison's attention shifted like a spotlight finding its target. "You're responsible for the advanced marksmanship program, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Thompson replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then you'll be personally escorting Captain Vasquez through today's exercises. Full access, complete cooperation, and the professional courtesy that any veteran sniper deserves. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, General." Morrison turned to address the entire group, her gaze sweeping across them like a searchlight, looking for additional problems that needed immediate correction. Gentlemen, let me be absolutely clear about something. This facility exists to train soldiers who will face life and death situations, where their marksmanship skills will determine whether they come home or whether their families receive folded flags. When someone with Captain Vasquez's background offers to evaluate our methods, the correct response is gratitude, not suspicion. She walked to the window and gestured toward where Elena still sat in patient observation. That woman has taken shots that most of your students will never be asked to attempt, under conditions that would make your worst training scenarios look like summer camp. She has experience that money cannot buy and credentials that blood and sacrifice have written in permanent ink. Dismissing her because she doesn't fit your preconceptions is not just unprofessional, it's a disservice to every soldier who will depend on the training you provide. Sergeant Park found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended. General, if we had known. That's exactly the problem. Morrison cut him off, her tone suggesting that explanations would not improve his situation. You should have known. Not because of her reputation, but because every person who walks through that door with proper authorization deserves basic professional respect. You failed to provide that, which means you failed as instructors and as representatives of this institution. The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket, and the three instructors began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. They had not simply been rude to a civilian contractor or dismissive of a Pentagon bureaucrat. They had disrespected a combat veteran whose service record existed in the kind of classified files that most people never even knew existed. Master. Sergeant Thompson. Morrison's voice carried the finality of a closing argument. You will personally apologize to Captain Vasquez and ensure that she has everything she needs to complete her evaluation. Sergeants Chun and Park, you will observe and learn. Consider this a professional development opportunity that you desperately need. As the instructors filed out to retrieve Elena from her patient vigil, General Morrison remained behind, staring out the window at the rifle range where advanced students were preparing for exercises that would test their precision, their patience, and their ability to perform under pressure. She found herself thinking about the disconnect between perception and reality, about how easy it was for people to see only what they expected to see instead of what was actually in front of them. Elena Vasquez represented something that made many people uncomfortable. Competence that did not announce itself, strength that did not need validation, and expertise that had been earned through experiences that could not be replicated in a training environment. She was proof that excellence came in forms that defied easy categorization, and that the most dangerous mistake any instructor could make was assuming they knew what their students were capable of based solely on surface appearances. The sound of approaching footsteps broke Morrison's contemplation, and she turned to see Master Sergeant Thompson leading Elena into the instructor area. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and obvious where there had been casual dismissal. Before, there was now careful attention. Where there had been assumptions about civilian incompetence, there was now respectful acknowledgement of proven expertise. Captain Vasquez, Thompson began, his voice carrying genuine contrition. I owe you an apology. We made assumptions about your background that were completely inappropriate, and we failed to provide the professional courtesy that your service has earned. Elena looked at him with those steady brown eyes, and Thompson found himself being evaluated by someone whose standards for professional competence had been forged in places where mistakes had consequences that extended far beyond hurt feelings or damaged egos. Apology accepted, she said simply, offering neither absolution nor extended discussion of the incident. If you're ready, Thompson continued, clearly eager to move past his earlier failure, we're beginning the 800-meter precision shooting evaluation. The students have been training on this module for 6 weeks, and today's exercise will determine who advances to the next phase of the program. Elena nodded and followed him toward the range, where 12 advanced students were preparing their equipment with the kind of focused attention that suggested they understood the importance of what they were about to attempt. Each shooting position was equipped with state-of-the-art rifles, precision optics, and environmental monitoring equipment that could measure wind speed, humidity, and atmospheric pressure with scientific accuracy. The scenario, Thompson explained, as they walked, simulates a high-value target elimination in an urban environment. Students must account for wind drift, bullet drop, and potential civilian casualties while making a precision shot under time pressure. Elena observed the preparations with professional interest, noting the quality of the equipment, the thoroughness of the setup, and the obvious dedication of the students who were treating the exercise with the seriousness it deserved. But she also noticed things that the instructors had apparently missed: environmental factors that were not being properly addressed, equipment configurations that could be improved, and training methodologies that reflected theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience. "Mind if I ask about your spotting procedures?" Elena's question was delivered in the same neutral tone she had maintained throughout the morning, but Thompson could hear the weight of experience behind it. "Standard military protocol," he replied. "Each shooter has a spotter who provides wind calls, range estimation, and target identification." "And the spotter's training?" 6 weeks of classroom instruction plus range time with experienced instructors. Elena nodded without comment, but General Morrison, who had joined them to observe the exercise, caught the subtle expression that crossed her face. It was the look of someone who had identified a problem, but was too professional to criticize, without being asked for specific feedback. The first student took his position at the firing line, a young corporal whose concentration was so intense it seemed to create a visible field around him. His spotters settled in beside him, both men working through the complex calculations required to place a bullet precisely where it needed to go at a distance that challenged both physics and human capability. "Wind from the northeast at 12 miles per hour, the spotter called out, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had practiced the scenario dozens of times in controlled conditions. "Confirmed," the shooter replied, making minute adjustments to his scope before settling into the kind of stillness that preceded either perfect success or spectacular failure. Elena watched the exchange with the focused attention of someone who could see layers of complexity that were invisible to casual observers. She noted the spotter's technique, the shooter's breathing pattern, the way they communicated, and the environmental factors they were accounting for in their calculations. More importantly, she noticed the environmental factors they were not accounting for. The shot rang out across the range, a sound that carried both authority and finality. At 800 meters, the bullet found its target, but not precisely where it had been intended. Close enough to pass the exercise, but not close enough to guarantee mission success in a real-world scenario, where inches could mean the difference between eliminating a threat and causing collateral damage. "Good shot," Thompson called out, his voice carrying the approval of someone who was satisfied with competent performance. Elena said nothing, but General Morrison noticed the way she tracked the bullet's impact through her own spotting scope, the subtle calculations she was performing in her head, and the almost imperceptible shake of her head that suggested she had seen something that concerned her. The exercise continued with similar results. Each student demonstrated competence that would meet standard military requirements, but none achieved the kind of precision that would be required for the most demanding mission profiles. Their shots were good enough for training standards, but Elena could see gaps in their technique that would become critical failures under the stress of actual combat operations. "Captain Vasquez," General Morrison said quietly, "you look like you have thoughts about what we're seeing." Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching as another student prepared for his attempt. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful, Neutrality of someone who had learned to offer criticism without causing offense. "The training is comprehensive," she said finally. "The students are dedicated and the equipment is excellent. But there are environmental factors that aren't being fully addressed in the calculations." "Such as?" Thompson asked, his earlier defensiveness replaced by genuine interest in learning from someone whose experience had been proven under fire. "Thermal layering," Elena replied, pointing toward the target area where heat waves were beginning to dance in the morning sun. "At this time of day, with this humidity, you're getting temperature variations that create different atmospheric densities at different elevations. The bullet's trajectory is going to be affected by those variations in ways that standard ballistic calculations don't account for." She paused, watching another shot miss its intended point of impact by a margin that would have been catastrophic in a real operation. "Also, the wind calls are being taken at the firing position, but wind conditions at 800 meters can be completely different. Without intermediate wind readings, you're calculating based on incomplete data." Thompson found himself leaning forward, suddenly understanding that he was receiving a masterclass from someone whose knowledge had been acquired through experiences that could not be replicated in any classroom setting. "How would you modify the training to address those issues?" Elena looked at him with those steady brown eyes, and for the first time since arriving at Fort Blackwater, she saw genuine interest rather than dismissive assumption. "Would you like me to show you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged rifle, and Elena could see the exact moment when Master Sergeant Thompson realized he was being offered something that textbooks could not provide. His earlier skepticism had been replaced by the eager attention of a professional who recognized the opportunity to learn from someone whose credentials had been written in blood rather than classroom theory. "Yes, ma'am," Thompson replied without hesitation. "If you're willing to demonstrate, we'd be honored to observe." Elena nodded once and walked toward the equipment area where spare rifles were stored in climate-controlled cases. Her movements were economical and purposeful as she selected a weapon, not the newest or most expensive model, but one whose balance and configuration suggested it had been properly maintained and zeroed. She handled the rifle with the kind of familiarity that came from thousands of hours of practice, checking the action, examining the scope, and making minute adjustments, with the efficiency of someone who could assemble the weapon blindfolded. General Morrison watched the preparation with growing anticipation. She had heard stories about Whisper's capabilities, fragments of after-action reports that had been sanitized and classified, but she had never witnessed the legend in action. The rifle range at Fort Blackwater was about to become the stage for a demonstration that would be talked about in military circles for decades to come. "Standard 800-meter target?" Elena asked, her voice carrying the same neutral professionalism she had maintained throughout the morning. "Actually," Thompson said, his confidence growing as he realized they were about to witness something exceptional, "we have targets staged at multiple distances. 800, 1,000, and 1,200 meters. The advanced students usually work up to the longer distances over several months." Elena looked through the spotting scope at the distant targets, calculating angles, wind patterns, and atmospheric conditions with the automatic precision of someone who had performed these assessments under circumstances where accuracy meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The targets at 1,200 meters were barely visible to the naked eye, small black circles that seemed to shimmer in the heat waves like mirages. 1,200 meters, she said simply, settling into a shooting position that looked deceptively casual but was actually the result of years of training and refinement. Her body found its natural point of aim with the kind of muscle memory that survived years of civilian life, positioning itself to work with the rifle rather than fighting against it. The students and instructors who had gathered to watch formed a loose semicircle behind the firing line, their conversations dropping to whispers as they realized they were about to witness something far beyond the scope of normal training exercises. Even the range safety officers had stopped their routine patrols to observe, sensing that something significant was about to occur. Elena's preparation was methodical but not rushed. She adjusted the scope for the extended distance, calculated the bullet drop compensation required for a shot that would challenge both physics and human capability, and began the complex process of reading environmental conditions that would affect her bullet's flight path over nearly 3/4 of a mile. Wind speed and direction? She asked, though her question was directed more toward the environment itself than any human spotter. Northeast at 14 miles per hour at the firing position, one of the students called out, consulting his handheld wind meter with the confidence of someone who had been trained to trust his equipment above all else. Elena shook her head slightly, a gesture so subtle that most observers missed it entirely. Wind at the target is different. Thermals are creating updrafts that are deflecting the airflow. Give me a minute. She settled into absolute stillness, her breathing controlled and economical, her attention focused on details that were invisible to everyone else on the range. She was reading the landscape itself, watching for signs that would tell her what the wind was doing at distances that electronic equipment could not measure. Grass movement, dust patterns, the way heat waves bent and shifted in the air, all provided information that could not be quantified by instruments, but could be interpreted by someone with enough experience to understand their language. Minutes passed in complete silence. Elena remained motionless, her rifle steady as a rock, her eye behind the scope tracking patterns and changes that painted a picture of atmospheric conditions across 1,200 meters of Georgian terrain. The students watched with growing amazement as they realized they were witnessing a level of patience and precision that exceeded anything they had encountered in their training. Master Sergeant Thompson found himself holding his breath, understanding that he was observing something that could not be taught through conventional methods. This was art as much as science, intuition backed by experience that had been gained in places where second chances did not exist. Thermal layer shift in 3, 2, 1, Elena murmured, her voice so quiet that only those closest to her could hear the words. The shot broke with perfect timing, the sound carrying across the range with authority that seemed to bend the air around it. At 1,200 meters, the bullet flew true, its trajectory calculated not just for distance and gravity, but for every environmental variable that could affect its flight through 3/4 of a mile of atmosphere that was constantly changing. The impact was perfect. Not close to perfect, not acceptable for training purposes, but geometrically precise, finding the exact center of a target that most shooters could barely see with magnified optics. The kind of shot that redefined what observers thought was possible with small arms, that challenged their understanding of human capability and mechanical precision. The range fell completely silent, except for the distant echo of the shot bouncing off the tree line behind the targets. Then someone started clapping, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm as others joined in. It was not the polite applause given to a competent demonstration, but the genuine recognition due to someone who had just performed what appeared to be magic, using nothing more than physics, mathematics, and skills that had been refined through experiences most people could not imagine. Elena did not acknowledge the applause. She was already cycling the bolt, chambering another round, her attention focused on environmental conditions that were constantly shifting in the morning heat. Wind pattern is changing, she said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone providing a weather report. Next shot will require different compensation. She adjusted her scope with minute precision, making calculations that accounted for factors that had changed in the seconds since her first shot. The thermal layers were shifting as the sun climbed higher, creating new atmospheric densities that would affect bullet trajectory in ways that standard ballistic tables could not predict. The second shot was even more impressive than the first. If such a thing were possible, Elena had compensated for environmental changes that were invisible to everyone else. placing her bullet in the exact center of the target, despite conditions that had shifted enough to throw off anyone relying solely on equipment and theoretical knowledge. How? The question came from Corporal David Kim, one of the advanced students who had been struggling with the 800-meter qualification all morning. His voice carried the frustrated amazement of someone who thought he understood marksmanship, until he witnessed something that redefined the entire concept. Elena looked at him with those steady brown eyes, and Kim found himself being evaluated by someone whose standards for precision had been forged in places where missing meant consequences that extended far beyond failed test scores. "Environmental reading," she replied simply. "The instruments give you baseline data, but the real information comes from understanding how air moves across terrain. Every landscape has its own signature, its own patterns of thermal activity and wind behavior. You have to learn to read those patterns the way you read a map." She gestured toward the target area, where heat waves continued to dance in patterns that seemed random, but actually followed predictable rules for anyone who understood the science behind them. At 1,200 meters, your bullet is flying through air that has different temperature, humidity, and pressure at different elevations. Those variations create deflection that changes constantly as atmospheric conditions shift. But how do you calculate for all those variables? Kim pressed, his voice carrying genuine desperation to understand something that seemed impossibly complex. "Experience," Elena said simply. "Thousands of shots under different conditions, learning to recognize patterns, understanding how your specific rifle and ammunition perform in environments that simulators cannot replicate." General Morrison stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat, but also the respect due to someone whose expertise exceeded her own in the specialized field. "Captain, would you be willing to work with our advanced students? Share some of the techniques that clearly are not covered in our current curriculum?" Elena considered the request for a long moment, her gaze moving across the faces of students who were looking at her with the kind of eager attention that suggested they understood they were being offered something that could not be found in any manual or classroom setting. "What specific challenges are they facing in the field?" she asked, her question revealing an understanding that training should be designed to address real-world requirements rather than abstract standards. "Urban environments mostly," Thompson replied, his earlier dismissiveness completely replaced by professional interest. "Situations where they need to make precision shots with minimal preparation time and accounting for civilian populations." Elena nodded, understanding immediately the complexity of what they were describing. Urban sniper operations required not just marksmanship skills but tactical awareness, environmental adaptation, and the kind of split-second decision-making that could only be developed through experience that most people hoped they would never need. "Show me your current urban simulation protocol," she said, walking toward the training area where computerized scenarios were used to test students under conditions that approximated real combat situations. The urban simulation system was impressive by any standard, featuring high-definition displays that created immersive environments, sophisticated ballistic modeling that accounted for multiple variables, and scenario programming that could replicate the chaos and complexity of actual combat operations. Students sat in specially designed shooting positions that mimicked real urban hide sites, using equipment identical to what they would employ in actual operations. Elena examined the system with professional interest, noting its capabilities, while also identifying limitations that became apparent when compared to the realities of actual urban combat. The scenarios were comprehensive but predictable. The environmental factors were modeled but not dynamic, and the stress levels were elevated, but not comparable to situations where lives actually hung in the balance. "Run the downtown hostage scenario," Thompson instructed the technician operating the system. "Full complexity, maximum time pressure." The simulation activated, filling the room with sounds and images that created an environment of controlled chaos. A terrorist had barricaded himself in a third-floor window with multiple hostages. Friendly forces were attempting to evacuate civilians from the area, and intelligence indicated that explosive devices might be present that could detonate if the target was not eliminated within a specific time frame. One of the advanced students, Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, took position behind the simulated rifle and began working through the complex calculations required to take a shot that would eliminate the threat without endangering hostages or friendly forces. The simulation was designed to test every aspect of sniper training: target identification, environmental compensation, ethical decision-making, and performance under extreme time pressure. Santos was competent and professional, working through her checklist with a thoroughness that had been drilled into her through months of training. She identified wind conditions, calculated bullet drop, estimated range, and prepared to take a shot that met all technical requirements for mission success. "Taking the shot," she announced, her voice steady despite the artificial stress created by the simulation's time pressure and complexity. The simulated rifle fired, and the computer registered a hit that was technically successful, but not optimal. The target was eliminated, but the bullet placement was close enough to the hostages that in a real-world situation, fragments or ricochets could have caused additional casualties. "Acceptable performance," Thompson announced, though Elena could hear reservation in his voice that suggested he understood the limitations of what they had just witnessed. Elena approached the simulation controls, her attention focused on environmental variables that the computer was modeling based on theoretical data rather than actual observation. "Mind if I adjust some parameters?" she asked, her fingers already moving across the interface with the confidence of someone who understood both the technology and the reality it was attempting to replicate. "What are you changing?" Santos asked, watching Elena modify settings that she had been trained to accept as fixed variables. "Wind patterns," Elena replied, her modifications creating atmospheric conditions that were more dynamic and realistic than the standard simulation. "Parameters. In urban environments, wind behavior is completely different from open terrain. Buildings create channeling effects, thermal variations, and turbulence that change constantly as the sun moves and temperatures shift." She activated the modified scenario, and immediately everyone in the room could see the difference. The environmental indicators were fluctuating in real time. Wind directions were shifting in patterns that followed the complex aerodynamics of urban landscapes, and the target area was subject to atmospheric conditions that challenged every assumption the students had been trained to make. "This is more like what you'll encounter in actual operations," Elena explained, settling into the shooting position with the fluid grace of someone who had performed these movements countless times under conditions where mistake meant consequences far more serious than failed test scores. The modified simulation was significantly more challenging than anything the students had previously encountered. Environmental conditions were changing too rapidly for standard calculation methods. Wind patterns were following the chaotic turbulence created by urban architecture, and time pressure was creating stress levels that tested every aspect of training and preparation. Elena worked through the complexity with methodical efficiency, but her approach was fundamentally different from what the students had been taught. Instead of relying on instruments and calculations, she was reading environmental signs, watching for patterns in the way air moved around buildings, noting thermal signatures that indicated atmospheric density variations. "Wind is channeling between buildings," she murmured, her voice carrying information that was not available through any instrument, creating a Venturi effect that's accelerating airflow through the shot corridor. "Standard calculations will be off by at least 2 minutes of angle." She made adjustments that seemed to defy the simulation's programming, compensating for variables that the computer could model but human operators had never learned to recognize. Her shot placement took into account not just the immediate environmental conditions, but the way those conditions were changing as atmospheric pressure shifted with the rising sun. The shot broke with perfect timing, finding its target with precision that eliminated the threat while maintaining safety, margins that would prevent collateral damage even under the chaotic conditions of actual combat operations. The simulation registered not just a successful shot, but an optimal shot, the kind of performance that separated adequate snipers from those whose skills could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The room erupted in spontaneous applause, but Elena was already analyzing the next scenario. Her attention focused on environmental factors that were beyond the scope of standard training but essential for operations in the complex environments where modern conflicts were fought. "How do you read air patterns that instruments can't measure?" Corporal Kim asked, his voice carrying the hunger of someone who had found a teacher capable of sharing knowledge that could not be acquired through conventional methods. Elena looked at him with the patient expression of someone who understood that teaching required more than just demonstration, that real learning came through understanding principles rather than memorizing techniques. "Start with the basics," she said, walking toward the window that offered a view of the actual training range. "See how the heat waves are moving across the concrete? That tells you about thermal activity. Notice how the grass is bending in different directions at different distances. That shows you wind patterns that handheld instruments miss because they only measure conditions at your position." She pointed toward specific features in the landscape that the students had been trained to ignore in favor of technological solutions. Every environment has its own personality, its own way of moving air and creating atmospheric variations. Urban environments are especially complex because buildings create microclimates that change constantly as sun angles shift and temperatures vary. But how do you calculate for all those variables without instruments? Santos asked, her question revealing the challenge of translating intuitive knowledge into teachable methods. "Practice," Elena replied simply. "Thousands of shots under different conditions, learning to recognize patterns, understanding how your equipment performs in environments that cannot be replicated in simulators." She turned back toward the group, her expression serious but not intimidating. "The instruments give you a starting point, but real precision comes from understanding the environment itself, learning to see what the air is doing, feeling how atmospheric pressure affects your body, recognizing signs that tell you when conditions are changing." General Morrison had been observing the entire demonstration with growing amazement, understanding that she was witnessing teaching methods that could revolutionize military marksmanship training. Elena was sharing knowledge that had been acquired through experiences that officially did not exist, refined through missions that could never be acknowledged, and proven under conditions that most soldiers would never face. "Captain Vasquez," the general said, her voice carrying the weight of command authority backed by genuine respect, "would you consider developing a curriculum that incorporates these techniques into our standard training program?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of the request. Teaching meant exposure, documentation, and the kind of official recognition that she had spent years avoiding. But it also meant sharing knowledge that could save lives, preparing soldiers for realities that conventional training did not address. "The techniques can be taught," she said finally, "but they require time, patience, and conditions that simulators cannot replicate. Students need experience shooting in different environments, under various atmospheric conditions, learning to read signs that change constantly. What would you need?" Morrison asked, her tone suggesting that resources would not be a limiting factor if the training could produce results comparable to what they had just witnessed. Elena looked out at the training range, then back at the eager faces of students, who were beginning to understand that they had been offered an opportunity to learn skills that existed nowhere else in the military training establishment. "Access to multiple ranges with different terrain features," she said, her mind already working through the requirements for training that would bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Time for extended exercises that allow students to experience how environmental conditions change throughout the day, and scenarios that replicate the stress and complexity of actual combat operations. Done, Morrison replied without hesitation. How soon can you start? Elena considered the question, thinking about promises she had made to herself and obligations that existed beyond official military service. She had come to Fort Blackwater to fulfill a final commitment before disappearing back into civilian anonymity, but what she had found was an opportunity to share knowledge that could make a difference in ways that extended far beyond her own. Service record. I'll need a week to develop a curriculum framework, she said finally. After that, we can begin with selected students who have demonstrated both technical competence and the patience required for advanced environmental training. The students exchanged glances that mixed excitement with apprehension, understanding that they were being offered something that would challenge every assumption they had made about marksmanship and precision shooting. This would not be the kind of training that could be completed through weekend exercises or classroom instruction, but immersive education that would require them to develop skills that existed at the intersection of science, art, and intuition. Master Sergeant Thompson stepped forward, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who had found a solution to problems he had been struggling with for years. Ma'am, if you're willing to share this knowledge, we have students who are hungry to learn and facilities that can be modified to support whatever training requirements you identify. Elena nodded, understanding that she had just committed to something that would extend far beyond her original intentions for visiting Fort Blackwater. But as she looked at the faces around her, she saw the same hunger for excellence that had driven her own development as a marksman, the same dedication to perfection that had sustained her through missions that pushed human capability to its absolute limits. We'll start with environmental awareness, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had proven her methods under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Learning to read signs that instruments miss, understanding how atmospheric conditions affect bullet trajectory over extended distances, and developing the patience required for shots that cannot be rushed. The late afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the training range, but the energy in the group had only intensified as they began to understand the scope of what they were being offered. Elena Vasquez had come to Fort Blackwater as an observer, but she was leaving as something far more valuable, a teacher whose knowledge had been acquired through experiences that could not be replicated, but could be shared with students who were willing to commit themselves to learning skills that existed nowhere else in the military training establishment. As the group began to disperse, each person carrying their own thoughts about what they had witnessed and what it might mean for their future development as soldiers and marksmen, Elena remained at the window, looking out at terrain that would soon become a classroom for teaching techniques that bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. General Morrison approached, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of command authority backed by genuine appreciation for what had been offered. Captain, I want you to know that what you've shared today will impact training throughout the entire special operations community. This kind of knowledge, it's invaluable. Elena turned from the window, her expression thoughtful but not self-congratulatory. The knowledge only has value if it saves lives, she replied simply. If these techniques help soldiers come home to their families, then sharing them was worthwhile. The general nodded, understanding that she was speaking with someone whose motivations extended far beyond career advancement or professional recognition. Elena Vasquez was driven by something more fundamental, the desire to ensure that future generations of soldiers would be better prepared for realities that she had learned through experiences that no one should have to repeat. As the day ended, and the last students left the training facility, Elena found herself alone with thoughts about promises kept and obligations fulfilled. She had come to Fort Blackwater to honor a commitment to people who could no longer keep their own promises. But what she had discovered was an opportunity to ensure that their sacrifices would continue to have meaning through knowledge shared and lives protected. The kill marks on her wrist seemed lighter somehow, their weight distributed among the students who would carry forward techniques that had been refined through experiences that officially had never happened, but whose impact would be felt for generations to come. In the end, that was perhaps the most fitting memorial possible: knowledge that would save lives, skills that would prevent the kind of losses that had marked her own service, and the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled in ways that extended far beyond individual recognition or reward. 3 weeks had passed since Elena Vasquez first demonstrated her extraordinary marksmanship capabilities at Fort Blackwater, and the ripple effects of that afternoon were still spreading through military training commands across the country. Word traveled fast in specialized communities, especially when it involved someone whose reputation existed only in whispered conversations among people with the highest security clearances. What had begun as a routine observation visit had evolved into something far more significant: a fundamental reassessment of how the military approached advanced marksmanship training. The conference room at the Pentagon was filled with officers whose collective experience represented decades of special operations leadership. But the conversation that morning centered around a woman who had been dismissed as too soft by instructors, who failed to recognize excellence when it appeared in unexpected forms. Colonel James Harrison, Director of Special Operations Training, reviewed files that contained enough redacted information to fill a small library, each black bar representing missions that officially never happened and accomplishments that could never be publicly acknowledged. "The preliminary reports from Fort Blackwater are extraordinary," he said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had learned to be skeptical of anything that seemed too good to be true. "Students who have been struggling with 800-meter qualifications are now consistently hitting targets at 1,200 meters. Urban simulation scores have improved by an average of 40% across all participants in Captain Vasquez's pilot program." Brigadier General Sarah Chun, whose own background included command of special operations units in 3 different theaters, leaned forward with the focused attention of someone who understood the implications of what was being discussed. "What makes her methods so different from our current curriculum? We have excellent instructors, state-of-the-art facilities, and training protocols that have been refined over decades." "Environmental reading," Colonel Harrison replied, consulting notes that attempted to translate intuitive knowledge into bureaucratic language. "She teaches students to interpret atmospheric conditions that instruments cannot measure, to recognize patterns in wind behavior and thermal activity that affect bullet trajectory in ways our current models don't account." 4. The room fell quiet as the assembled officers considered the implications. Military training had always balanced innovation with proven methods, but what Elena was offering represented something that challenged fundamental assumptions about how marksmanship skills were developed and maintained. Her techniques could not be replicated through equipment purchases or curriculum modifications alone. They required teaching methods that existed somewhere between science and art. "There's another factor," General Chun said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had commanded troops in combat zones where precision shooting meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Captain Vasquez's background, the missions she completed, the environment she operated in, the pressure she performed under. That kind of experience cannot be simulated or replicated through conventional training. "Which brings us to the central question," Colonel Harrison continued, his attention turning toward a folder marked with security classifications that most people in the room had never seen. "Do we have the authority to offer her a position that would allow her to share this knowledge on a larger scale? Her current civilian status limits what we can do officially, but the potential impact of her training methods could revolutionize special operations capability. The discussion that followed touched on bureaucratic complexities that seemed almost absurd when measured against the reality of what Elena had accomplished in just 3 weeks of unofficial instruction. Security clearances, budget allocations, personnel classifications, and administrative procedures that had been designed to manage conventional problems, but were inadequate for dealing with someone whose expertise existed outside normal institutional frameworks. Meanwhile, at Fort Blackwater, Elena was concluding another training session that had challenged every assumption her students had made about their own capabilities. The morning exercises had involved precision shooting under conditions that replicated the atmospheric complexity of actual combat environments, forcing students to abandon their reliance on instruments in favor of skills that required patience, observation, and intuitive understanding of environmental factors. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos lay prone behind her rifle, eye pressed to the scope as she tracked wind patterns across terrain that seemed designed to confuse every calculation she had been taught to make. The target at 1,400 meters shimmered in heat waves that created the illusion of movement, while atmospheric conditions shifted constantly as the Georgia sun climbed higher and thermal activity increased throughout the morning. "What do you see?" Elena asked, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who understood that real learning required time and repetition rather than quick answers and immediate results. "Wind flag showing northeast at 10 miles per hour, Santos replied, consulting the visible indicators that had been the foundation of her training for months. "Range cards indicate bullet drop compensation of 32 clicks, and atmospheric pressure is standard for this elevation. Now stop looking at your instruments," Elena said quietly. "Look at the environment itself. What is the grass doing at 600 meters? How are the heat waves moving across the concrete at 1,000? What does the way dust is settling tell you about air movement that your wind flags cannot measure?" Santos lifted her eye from the scope and began the process of environmental reading that Elena had been teaching, a skill that seemed impossibly complex at first, but gradually revealed patterns that were as reliable as any instrument reading. The grass at intermediate distances was bending in directions that contradicted the wind flags at her position, indicating air movement that was being channeled and modified by terrain features that created microclimates within the larger atmospheric system. "The wind is different at the target," Santos said slowly, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had discovered something that had been invisible moments before. "It's being deflected by that ridgeline, creating turbulence that's not showing up on my readings here." "Good," Elena replied, her approval carrying the weight of someone whose standards had been forged under conditions where such observations could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Now, what does that mean for your shot placement?" Santos worked through calculations that incorporated information that existed nowhere in her training manuals, adjusting her scope to compensate for environmental factors that she was learning to recognize through observation rather than instrumentation. The shot that followed was not just accurate but optimal, finding its target with precision that reflected an understanding of atmospheric conditions that most marksmen never developed. "Outstanding," Elena said simply, but Santos could hear genuine satisfaction in the single word. This was not the empty praise given to adequate performance, but recognition of achievement that represented mastery of skills that few people ever acquired. The training session continued with similar exercises, each designed to challenge students' assumptions about environmental factors while building their confidence in abilities they were discovering they possessed. Elena's teaching methods were unconventional by institutional standards, but devastatingly effective in producing results that exceeded anything the students had previously achieved. Corporal David Kim, who had struggled with medium-range qualifications for months, was now consistently hitting targets at distances that had seemed impossible just weeks before. His improvement was not just technical, but psychological, reflecting growing confidence in his ability to read environmental signs that had been invisible to him before. Elena's instruction. "Ma'am," Kim said during a brief break between exercises, his voice carrying curiosity that had been building throughout their training sessions. "How long did it take you to develop these skills? I mean, learning to read wind patterns and atmospheric conditions the way you do." Elena considered the question seriously, thinking about years of development that had begun with conventional training but evolved through experiences that could not be replicated in any classroom environment. "The basic techniques can be learned relatively quickly," she replied, "but real proficiency requires time and practice under varying conditions. Different environments, different weather patterns, different times of day. Every situation teaches you something new." "But you learned in combat zones," Kim pressed, his statement carrying implicit understanding that her education had been acquired under circumstances that added urgency and consequence to every lesson. "Experience is experience," Elena said simply, neither confirming nor denying the obvious truth that her skills had been developed in places where mistakes carried consequences far beyond failed test scores. "What matters is being willing to learn from every shot, every miss, every environmental condition that challenges your assumptions." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant Thompson, whose demeanor had undergone a complete transformation since Elena's first day at Fort Blackwater. Where there had once been dismissive skepticism, there was now respectful collaboration and genuine enthusiasm for training methods that were producing results he had never seen in 2 decades of military instruction. "Captain," Thompson said, his voice carrying news that had the weight of significance, "General Morrison wants to see you in her office. Something about a call from Washington." Elena nodded, understanding that bureaucratic wheels had been turning while she focused on the immediate task of training students who were hungry to learn skills that existed nowhere else in the military education system. She had known that her presence at Fort Blackwater would eventually attract attention from higher levels of command, but she had hoped to complete her training program before administrative complexities interfered with the work of actually preparing soldiers for realities they would face in the field. The walk to General Morrison's office gave Elena time to consider the implications of whatever message had arrived from the Pentagon. She had spent years avoiding the kind of official recognition that would draw attention to capabilities she preferred to keep private, but the success of her training program had made anonymity increasingly difficult to maintain. General Morrison's office reflected the practical sensibilities of someone who had spent more time in the field than behind a desk, with maps, deployment photos, and commendation certificates that told the story of a career dedicated to military excellence. The general herself looked up from paperwork as Elena entered, her expression carrying the weight of someone who had just received information that would change everything about their current situation. "Captain Vasquez," Morrison began, her voice carrying formal authority softened by genuine respect, "I've just concluded a conference call with the Joint Chiefs regarding your training program here at Fort Blackwater. The results you've achieved have attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership." Elena remained silent, understanding that this conversation would determine whether her work at Fort Blackwater could continue or whether bureaucratic complications would force her to return to the civilian anonymity she had maintained for years. "They want to offer you a position," Morrison continued, consulting notes that summarized discussions involving people whose names appeared in classified documents rather than public directories. "Senior instructor for advanced marksmanship, with authority to develop curriculum for the entire special operations community. Full reinstatement of military status, promotion to major, and assignment to a new training command that would be established specifically to support your methods." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a discharged rifle, carrying implications that extended far beyond personal recognition or career advancement. Elena understood that accepting would mean exposing herself to the kind of official scrutiny she had spent years avoiding, but it would also mean ensuring that knowledge acquired through experiences that could never be publicly acknowledged would be preserved and shared with future generations of soldiers. What would be the scope of such a position? Elena asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who needed to understand all implications before making a decision that could not be reversed. Complete authority over advanced marksmanship. Training for special operations units, Morrison replied, her tone suggesting that the resources available would be limited only by Elena's imagination and requirements. Access to facilities, personnel, and equipment necessary to implement training methods based on your experience. And most importantly, the ability to ensure that the knowledge you've developed reaches soldiers who need it most. Elena walked to the window that offered a view of the training range where her students were continuing their exercises, their movements reflecting growing confidence and abilities they were discovering through methods that existed nowhere else in military education. She could see Sergeant Santos working through environmental calculations that would have been impossible for her just weeks before, while Corporal Kim tracked wind patterns with the focused attention of someone who had learned to see what had previously been invisible. The techniques I teach cannot be reduced to standard curriculum, Elena said finally, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the complexity of translating intuitive knowledge into institutional frameworks. They require individual instruction, extended practice periods, and training environments that replicate the atmospheric complexity of actual combat operations. We understand, Morrison replied, her tone indicating that bureaucratic flexibility would be available to support whatever methods Elena deemed necessary. The position would include authority to modify existing training protocols, establish new facilities as needed, and recruit instructors who could be trained in your methods. Elena turned from the window, her expression thoughtful but not yet committed. How many students? Initially, selected personnel from each special operations unit, Morrison said, consulting figures that represented the scope of impact Elena's methods could have across the entire military community. Eventually, integration into advanced training for all precision shooting specialists. We're talking about fundamentally changing how the military approaches marksmanship education. The weight of the decision settled on Elena's shoulders like equipment she had carried into places where every choice determined whether everyone came home safely. Accepting the position would mean abandoning the civilian anonymity she had maintained since leaving active duty, but it would also mean ensuring that knowledge acquired through experiences that officially never happened would continue to save lives for generations to come. I'll need guarantees, Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to negotiate from positions of strength even when circumstances suggested otherwise. Complete autonomy over training methods, selection of personnel, and development of curriculum. No interference from people who think they understand marksmanship because they've read manuals or attended briefings. Done, Morrison replied without hesitation, understanding that Elena's conditions were not demands for special treatment, but requirements for effectiveness that could not be compromised by bureaucratic interference. And I'll need access to facilities that can replicate environmental conditions from multiple theaters of operation. Elena continued, her mind already working through requirements for training that would prepare students for realities they might face anywhere in the world. Desert conditions, mountain environments, urban settings, maritime operations. Students need experience shooting under atmospheric conditions that vary as widely as their potential deployment locations. Whatever you need, Morrison assured her tone indicating that resource limitations would not be allowed to interfere with training effectiveness. Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering implications that extended far beyond personal career choices. The position being offered represented an opportunity to ensure that future generations of soldiers would be better prepared for Realities that she had learned through experiences that no one should have to repeat, but it also meant accepting responsibility for institutional change on a scale that would affect thousands of military personnel. "There's one more condition," Elena said finally, her voice carrying the weight of something that was more important than all the practical considerations combined. "I want to establish a memorial program. Recognition for soldiers whose service in precision shooting operations cannot be publicly acknowledged, but whose sacrifices deserve to be remembered." General Morrison's expression softened, understanding that Elena was speaking about people whose names appeared in classified casualty reports rather than public memorial services, whose families received folded flags and carefully worded letters. About national security rather than detailed accounts of heroism and sacrifice. "Absolutely," Morrison replied, her voice carrying genuine emotion for the first time in their conversation. "Whatever form that recognition should take, we'll make it happen." Elena nodded, understanding that she had just committed to something that would define the remainder of her career and possibly her life. The decision felt right in ways that had nothing to do with personal advancement and everything to do with ensuring that knowledge acquired through experiences that could never be fully shared would continue to protect people who were willing to serve in places where precision shooting meant the difference between mission success and unacceptable losses. "I accept," she said simply, the words carrying weight that extended far beyond their surface meaning. 2 months later, the Advanced Environmental Marksmanship Training Center at Fort Bragg was operating at full capacity, with students arriving from special operations units across all branches of the military. The facility that Elena had designed incorporated training environments that replicated atmospheric conditions from every major theater of operation, allowing students to develop skills under circumstances that prepared them for realities they might face anywhere in the world. Major Elena Vasquez, her new rank reflecting recognition that had been delayed by years of classified service, stood before a class of instructors who would carry her methods to training facilities throughout the military education system. These were not typical classroom students, but experienced soldiers, whose own marksmanship credentials were impressive by any standard, yet who were here to learn techniques that existed nowhere else in institutional knowledge. Environmental reading is not an abstract skill, Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose methods had been proven under conditions that could not be replicated in any simulation. It's survival technique that happens to involve precision shooting. Every environmental factor that affects your bullet's trajectory can also provide information about conditions that might impact your mission in other ways. The students listened with the focused attention of people who understood they were receiving knowledge that could not be found in manuals or acquired through conventional training methods. These were instructors who would return to their own facilities with techniques that would fundamentally change how their students approached precision shooting, creating a cascade effect that would eventually reach every soldier whose duties might involve marksmanship under combat conditions. Sergeant Major Robert Anderson, whose own sniper credentials included operations in 4 different countries, raised his hand with the respectful manner of someone who recognized expertise when he encountered it. "Ma'am, how do we translate these techniques into standard curriculum without losing the individual instruction component that seems essential for developing real proficiency?" Elena had anticipated the question, understanding that institutional implementation would require balancing effectiveness with efficiency in ways that preserve the core elements of environmental reading, while making them accessible to larger numbers of students. "Start with observation exercises that teach pattern recognition," she replied, walking toward a display that showed atmospheric conditions from multiple environments. "Students need to learn to see what air movement looks like before they can interpret its impact on bullet trajectory. Once they understand the visual signs, the mathematical calculations become intuitive rather than abstract." She activated a video display that showed wind patterns across different types of terrain, each environment creating its own signature of air movement that could be read by someone who understood what to look for. Urban environments, mountain regions, desert conditions, each has predictable patterns that can be learned through observation and practice. The training session continued for hours, with Elena sharing techniques that bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Her students were experienced instructors themselves, but they found themselves challenged by concepts that required them to abandon their reliance on instruments in favor of skills that demanded patience, observation, and intuitive understanding of environmental factors. At the end of the day, as the last students filed out of the training facility, Elena remained behind to review lesson plans that would be implemented at installations around the world. The impact of her work was already being measured in improved performance statistics and mission success rates that reflected better preparation for environmental factors that had previously been addressed only through theoretical knowledge. A soft knock on her office door interrupted her concentration, and she looked up to see Corporal Kim, now Sergeant Kim, whose improvement under her training had been so dramatic that he had been selected as one of the first instructor candidates for the new program. "Ma'am," Kim said, his voice carrying excitement that was carefully controlled but unmistakable, "I wanted to thank you for recommending me for the instructor program. I never thought I'd be qualified to teach marksmanship to other soldiers." Elena looked at him with the patient expression of someone who understood that confidence was often the last skill that students developed, long after their technical abilities had exceeded their own expectations. "You earned your position through performance, Sergeant. The techniques I taught you are only as valuable as your ability to share them with others who need them. It's hard to believe how much my shooting has improved," Kim continued, his voice carrying amazement that suggested he still occasionally surprised himself with what he was capable of achieving. "6 months ago, I was struggling with basic qualifications. Now I'm hitting targets at distances I couldn't even see clearly before." "The capability was always there," Elena replied simply. "You just needed to learn to see what was already in front of you." Kim nodded, understanding that her words carried meaning that extended beyond marksmanship, training into areas of personal development that would serve him throughout his military career and beyond. The confidence he had gained through mastering environmental reading techniques would influence every aspect of his performance as a soldier and as an instructor responsible for preparing others to face challenges that demanded precision under pressure. After Kim left, Elena returned to her review of training materials that would soon be implemented at facilities across the military education system. Each lesson plan represented knowledge that had been acquired through experiences that could never be fully documented, refined through missions that officially never happened, and proven under conditions that she hoped future generations of soldiers would never have to face. The memorial program she had requested was taking shape as well, creating recognition for soldiers whose service in precision shooting operations could not be publicly acknowledged but whose sacrifices deserved to be remembered by the communities they had served. The names would remain classified, but their contributions would be honored through training programs that ensured their knowledge continued to protect people who were willing to serve in places where marksmanship meant the difference between mission success and unacceptable losses. Elena's telephone rang, interrupting her thoughts about legacy and responsibility. The call was from General Morrison, whose voice carried news that had become routine over the past months as reports arrived from installations where Elena's training methods were being implemented. "Major," Morrison said, her tone carrying satisfaction that reflected institutional pride in programs that were exceeding all performance expectations. "We just received the quarterly statistics from Fort Campbell. Students who completed your environmental marksmanship course are showing 47% improvement in precision shooting evaluations, and their confidence ratings have increased across all categories." "Good," Elena replied, though her Satisfaction was tempered by understanding that statistics could never fully capture the human impact of training that prepared soldiers for realities they hoped never to encounter. How are the instructor candidates progressing? Beyond all expectations, Morrison answered. Consulting reports that documented the success of Elena's approach to training trainers who would carry her methods throughout the military education system. We have requests from allied nations who want to send personnel for training in environmental marksmanship techniques. Apparently, word is spreading through international special operations communities. Elena considered the implications of expanding her program to include international students, understanding that sharing knowledge across allied militaries could multiply the impact of techniques that had been developed through specifically American operational experience but had universal applications for precision shooting under challenging environmental conditions. We'll need to modify some curriculum elements for different climatic regions, Elena said, her mind already working through requirements for training that would address environmental conditions that varied significantly across different geographical areas. Mountain warfare in the Alps creates different atmospheric challenges than desert operations in the Middle East. Whatever modifications are necessary, Morrison assured her, indicating that resources would be available to support expansion that could strengthen relationships with allied nations while sharing knowledge that had proven its value through American military experience. The conversation continued with discussion of administrative details that were necessary for institutional implementation, but seemed almost absurd when measured against the reality of what Elena's training accomplished. Budget allocations, personnel assignments, equipment procurement, and bureaucratic procedures that had been designed to manage conventional programs but were stretched to accommodate training methods that existed nowhere else in military education. After the call ended, Elena walked to the window that offered a view of training ranges where her students continued to develop skills that would serve them throughout their military careers and beyond. The evening light was casting long shadows across terrain that had become a laboratory for techniques that bridged the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application, where soldiers learned to see environmental factors that instruments could not measure and to make calculations that required intuition as much as mathematics. In the distance, she could see groups of students working through exercises that challenged their assumptions about atmospheric conditions while building confidence in abilities they were discovering through methods that had never been documented in any manual. Their improvement was measured not just in accuracy statistics, but in the growing understanding that precision shooting required mastery of environmental factors that extended far beyond ballistic calculations. The kill marks on Elena's wrist had taken on different meaning over the months since her arrival at Fort Blackwater. Where they had once represented weight that she carried alone, they now served as reminders of knowledge that was being shared with people who would carry it forward to protect others who might face similar challenges. The memorial program would ensure that soldiers whose service could not be publicly acknowledged would be remembered through training that preserved their contributions and prepared future generations to face whatever challenges awaited them. Elena's transition from observer to instructor to program director had happened with bureaucratic speed that surprised everyone involved, but the results justified the rapid implementation. Students who had struggled with basic marksmanship qualifications were now achieving precision shooting capabilities that exceeded institutional standards, while instructor candidates were preparing to carry environmental reading techniques to facilities throughout the military education system. The evening air was cooling as Elena concluded her review of materials that would shape precision shooting training for decades to come. Each lesson plan represented experience that had been acquired through circumstances that could never be replicated, but could be shared with people who were willing to learn skills that demanded patience, observation, and understanding of environmental factors that existed beyond the reach of technological solutions. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and continued development of techniques that existed at the intersection of science and intuition. But tonight, Elena allowed herself the satisfaction of knowing that knowledge acquired through experiences that officially never happened was being preserved and shared in ways that would continue to protect people who were willing to serve in places where precision shooting meant the difference between mission success and unacceptable losses. The stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky above Fort Bragg, each point of light a reminder of the vast atmospheric complexity that affected every shot taken at extended distances. Elena understood that her students were learning to read signs that existed in that complexity, developing skills that would serve them wherever their service might take them, carrying forward knowledge that honored the memory of people whose contributions could not be publicly acknowledged, but whose sacrifices would never be forgotten. In the end, that was perhaps the most fitting memorial possible: knowledge that would save lives, skills that would prevent the kind of losses that had marked her own service, and the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled in ways that extended far beyond individual recognition or reward. The kill marks on her wrist would always carry their weight, but that weight was now distributed among hundreds of students who would carry forward techniques that ensured the ultimate victory of those who had paid the price for the knowledge that was now being shared with people who would face whatever challenges awaited them in a world where precision shooting remained a skill that could mean the difference between coming home and becoming a casualty report filed in classified archives. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.